Good afternoon. Is there a microphone or is this just for online people? Okay, good. Well, it's good to see everyone and thank you so much for joining this particular forum. We're thrilled to have Shannon O'Loughlin here and Mary Hudetz. Thank you so much for journeying in for this important discussion. And Dan, thank you so much for your leadership across the campus and alongside so many others on our NAGPRA Repatriation Committee. And it's wonderful that so many people have turned out today for this important discussion. As we all know, the University of North Dakota has been facing issues with repatriation and with NAGPRA compliance. And I've said before, our commitment remains strong to comply with NAGPRA and to understand the steps that we have to take as a campus. Those steps have been significant over the last year, and we have a long way to go. Today's discussion, though, is not about the particular case, rather to give all of you a good understanding of what NAGPRA entails and the important sacred and moral responsibility all universities and museums have to make sure that we comply with what NAGPRA asks us to do, and in particular, returning sacred items and ancestors back to their lands. And this is a solemn commitment that we all must undertake, requires an incredible amount of work and an incredible understanding of what the law tells us and what effective practice in partnership with tribal nations really means to make sure that we can do this the right way. And so I'm thrilled that, so I didn't know how many would be here today, but I'm thrilled that you are all here. And in addition, I think we have people joining us online as well. So thanks to those who are joining us from. And with that, let me turn it over to Dan Lewerenz for his remarks and his introduction. So Dan, thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming out, being a part of this conversation. As President Armacost said, when the news broke here at the University of North Dakota, there were some of us who were familiar with the issues, legal issues, moral issues, cultural issues around repatriation. But a lot of you probably heard words like repatriation or acronyms like NAGPRA for the first time and are still trying to feel out what it is that this university and universities around the country, institutions around the country, are now finding themselves dealing with. We wanted to foster of what these, why they're important, why so many institutions place that they. And I'm thrilled to be joined for this by people who bring together kind of both of my professional backgrounds and who frankly know a lot more about this subject than I do. I'm going to start at the far end with Mary Hudetz, who I know from my journalism days. She and I both worked at the Associated Press, although I don't think we overlapped. I think I was gone by the time you started at the AP. Both of us served in leadership with the Native American Journalists Association. And I'm going to let Mary continue to introduce herself. Go ahead, Mary.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I've been a journalist for about 15 years. I went to the University of Montana and then started working for the Associated Press pretty much right out of school, and have worked throughout the West, primarily covering Indian country. And in the last, gosh, how long has it been? 5 years, really moved into just exclusively doing investigations versus day-to-day news. And I think I've done some big projects, but I think this has been the biggest project in scope that I've tackled, which is on repatriation. And I'll talk about more today. And then I'm most important, I can't believe this is not the first thing I didn't say, but I'm a member of the Crow tribe. I'm of Salika, grew up in Montana. And I now live in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
And see where institutions in your communities are on these issues. In between us is Shannon O'Loughlin, who is I know from my legal work, and we worked together very closely when I was at the Native American Rights Fund, and she is currently at the Association on American Indian Affairs. So tell us more about yourself, Shannon.
I will, Dan. Thank you. And it's wonderful to be here and such an honor to be on your campus. Thank you for sharing it with me. Like Dan said, my name is Shannon O'Loughlin. I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and I'm the CEO and attorney for the Association on American Indian Affairs. It's the oldest nonprofit serving Indian country. We've been around since 1922. I look pretty good, right? For all that. But I have a lot of repatriation efforts, not just from law practice, where some of the first Native nations that I worked with, their priority was repatriation. They had been working on repatriation issues for decades before I ever got there in the early 2000s. And they were not successful. And it seems that having an attorney come and join them in their NAGPRA work helped things along a bit. I've also served on the NAGPRA Review Committee, appointed by President Obama to the State Department Cultural Property Advisory Committee, and was thereafter let go by President Trump. And really happy to be here today and see what we can get into. Thanks, Dan.
About the Indian Child Welfare Act, another thing that is one of the priorities for her organization. I'll give you a little bit of a brief introduction to myself. Again, my name is Dan Lewerenz. I'm a member of the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. I spent about 10 years as a reporter with the Associated Press and 10, 12 years as an attorney, but I come to this repatriation work less from my journalism experience and less even from my legal experience. It's from my family experience. For many, many years, my grandfather handled all of the repatriation for our tribe. And so when ancestors were found, when items were found, and people reached out to our tribe, it was my grandfather's job to bring those back home. And my grandfather often, when he needed help, asked me to do that. And so my experience is more from sort of personal work with this than even from my legal experience. But the people here at the university asked me to speak on this program, and I was like, I don't know what I can tell you, but I know people who can tell you a lot more than I can. So I'm so glad both of you are here. I want to start by talking about or asking about the terms here. Shannon, when we say repatriation, what does that word mean? What is it that we're talking about?
Yeah, and I think the definition most of us may be familiar with regarding repatriation is about returning soldiers home from foreign wars. That's where the term originated. What happened was Native advocates who were working to bring in the American Indian Museum, George Gustav High Museum, which was long in an existence city. That museum was being sold in the Smithsonian under its wings. So today it's known as National Museum of Indian. So in the legislation that approved of that transaction, Native advocates were also talking about the collections of ancestors that were in boxes and boxes. And it was there in that term repatriation. Bring our ancestors home from war and the violence that's been perpetrated against their bodies. So that was kind of how the term originated. And the NMAI Act passed with repatriation. And it was thereafter that NAGPRA came into existence.
Repatriation is not necessarily a Native concept or something that's inherent, specific to Native communities, but is one that Native communities have needed to embrace because of circumstances they and their communities found themselves in.
Absolutely. And it's become a term that's used even more broadly than returning ancestors. So it's about returning the things that have been taken of our culture, of the things that make us who. So our native bodies, our cultural heritage items, our sacred items, funerary objects that were placed lovingly with those bodies. There's also terms such as rematriation, which is, of course, the mother or the female part of that word, and it's often used to turn those indigenous seeds back into the earth to be reborn. So you'll hear those terms interchangeably among various things where nature seeking the items, cultural heritage, tangible and back home.
You're right.
In part because what journalists do is explain complicated things in the world around us to people who aren't experts.
Mhm.
And so when we talk about being out of compliance with NAGPRA here on campus and trying to get back into compliance, and when you were reporting on NAGPRA around the country, what is NAGPRA? What does it mean?
Yeah, I tend to, I guess it's kind of a good place to start in a way, just that I have can offer like the basic understanding of the law and the way the public might digest it. But NAGPRA means, stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And as Shannon said, it was passed just after the National Museum of American Indian Act in 1990. There's a lot of similarities between the laws, but they address different institutions, their repatriation components too. At ProPublica, we've been reporting now for many months on the repatriation portion of NAGPRA. So NAGPRA, passed in 1990 by Congress, really called on institutions to begin the process of returning ancestors, funerary items to tribes. It essentially addressed centuries of grave looting and excavations by some of the country's premier institutions, and which had collected hundreds of thousands of Native American ancestors over the years. A lot of that began through this desire for public research, and like they say, in the public interest, and a desire to be elite public research institutions. And then the excavations evolved. So can I go through the history really briefly here, and start to include, but all kind of a little bit in the name of American expansion. Excavations started, the reasons for them started to be also for building infrastructure. Tennessee Valley Authority is an agency that once had among the largest collections. It's hard to use the word collections talking about ancestors, but I'll use that today. And then, so NAGPRA wanted to address the looting. It was considered human rights legislation, and I came about because of the advocacy of Native people over decades. It required a couple of very basic things of institutions that received federal funding. One was that they make a list, they inventory what they have, and they go through their collections and then publicly report, or at least report to the federal government, their holdings, particularly what came from Native American grave sites, so ancestors and their belongings. And institutions were given, many were given 3 to 5 years to report those inventories, and then the institutions with the most, like with vast collections, such as Harvard University, University of California, Berkeley, and others, were given a full decade. And it's really to account for the level, the aggressive, I mean, people don't often say it this way, but they had that time, they had large collections because they had so historically collected in such an aggressive way. So around 2021, I started at ProPublica, and it'd been more than 30 years since the law passed. And by that time, institutions had really only repatriated less than half of what they had initially reported holding. So we asked some pretty basic questions. Why why? What is holding up repatriation? Why haven't they returned what they had? I was very aware of sort of the argument that repatriation is expensive, but we also, I think, as investigative reporters, like to dig into the decisions that have led to the circumstances that we have today. So we used the basic requirements of the law, which requires institutions to report what they have. We used that reporting and the database that has since come about in the last 30 years to basically launch our investigation. And so I can keep going. You might have some questions. Sure.
This conversation is a real world example of how knowing about public information and how to access public information can lead to real world results. What is it? How did you guys go about reporting on NAGPRA compliance nationwide? What tools did you use?
So we did use the tools that the law requires institutions, like the requirements of the law, essentially. And so the inventories that they reported have been made into data. The inventories that they reported also comprise of sort of lists that we could sort of read and understand reasoning for not returning ancestors, that are why they had declared them as, we should talk about this term too, culturally unidentifiable. And we use that in a couple of ways. One was to create a database, which I can walk through really quick, with the idea that what does it mean to make this data that has existed for decades accessible to the public, and hopefully become a tool also for tribes in seeking repatriations, and basically, add another tool to the many that, like, this work has been occurring long before our investigation started, especially at AAIA. And then we also use that data to determine different stories to pursue.
Play this out in the ideal. Let's imagine an institution that perfectly complied with its NAGPRA obligations, both legal and kind of the moral obligations around the law and the idea of repatriation. What would that look like? What should happen?
Right. What should happen, and it is happening, and it has happened over the last 30 years. So I don't want anyone to think that this work is kind of flopping around in the wind. There are institutions there who have been extremely vigilant about their work under NAGPRA, and even with large collections, have been able to work with tribes effectively and efficiently, simply repatriate. So how would you do that? So there's the act, there's NAGPRA, the act, and then there are its regulations were developed and published in 1995. And those regulations lay out a simple administrative process of how museums are supposed to undertake the work of repatriation. And simply to get started, as Native. So that's not a big question or legal question. You have anything Native American institution, and maybe a question even before that is, are you a museum under the law? Because many institutions don't understand that they're a museum under the law. The law is defined very broadly of what a museum is. And it's not a traditional museum. Yes. A museum could entail a small city library in some little small county that's rural. Any institution that is in receipt of federal funds since November 16th, 1990, with Native American collection is considered a museum under the law. No, you don't have to do any of that. You don't have to have exhibits of native collections. You have items in boxes in your basement, and you're an institution under the law. You are a museum with NAG. There are two parts of NAGPRA inventories apply to and their other part of NAGPRA repatriation provisions, summary. In summaries, a shorter abbreviated process, but it applies to unassociated cultural patrimony and sacred objects. So there are two different processes. We're focusing mostly on the inventory process in ancestors. It seems to be hurting activity that's part of. So simply you would find out, well, here are my ancestors. So these are the ancestors. Where are they from? Is there geography that could affiliate these Native American human beings to a present day tribe? And so if you have geography, you can easily consult with tribes, make a determination of affiliation and repatriation. It's literally that simple. Where many institutions go wrong is they see that there's geography, and when we look at the inventories, we'll see that many of the ancestors are already associated. If they're once they have a place, many institutions want to continue to dig, because if you think about academia, research institutes, literal museums, they're based on wanting to understand, respond to questions about that is much more scientifically based, right? They want to find close to 100%. But the process of NAGPRA is a research project, not a study. It's not to find the perfect answer. It's to find it's about making a reasonable determination about whether there's a shared relationship between the ancestor and present day tribe. So simply finding geography, bringing in tribes that are that geography, consulting with those tribes affiliated is the easiest thing to do and what the law provides for. Now, where there's absolutely, so there's no geographical, there's no funerary objects that may or provide cultural evidence, symbols or types of objects that if there's absolutely no information, then the regulations would call that culturally unidentifiable. And as we'll see from the numbers, that's data showing us. The data is showing of the ancestors that have been reported by institutions. Numbers are also not all the reported those numbers. Also doesn't include international institutions because NAGPRA doesn't apply to anything outside of the United States. So many say there's out there that don't know.
You and your team reported on is what's actually happening out there, how NAGPRA is and isn't being complied with. Can you walk us through some of that? And I know that Mike's got your database called up and can help you walk through some of that.
Yeah, sure. So I would say, just to jump off Shannon's point a little, we'll walk, this is all numbers and data on this point, but it is such a small subset of the data in which there's no information associated. And so it's like in the very low hundreds, I believe, of many, many thousands of inventories that have been reported. As far as what we have seen across the country, so there's the data set, what it shows is that more than 600 institutions have had to report inventories under NAGPRA. That number, I would say, want to say it's a couple hundred that have actually completed the process. And so it's essentially 400 that hold 100,000 Native American ancestors. And then from our reporting, we had learned that about 10 institutions have a list on this page, but so my numbers might just be off on my memory, but about 10 institutions actually hold half of all of the collections that exist in museums of Native American ancestors that exist in museums. And so that tells us, like, if these institutions were to do the work, I guess you can't help but ask the question, well, then this process would actually be a lot further along. But we, like I said, use the data as a foundational piece of our reporting to one, see what progress is, create this database, and then to create, start to pursue a few in-depth, long-form, like written investigations. So I guess we thought we'd share this just because I think this tool makes the numbers accessible to everybody, and think about it. Our region, if you want to scroll down just a little, or actually type in, sorry, the search bar is there, North Dakota. And so there's a few ways to use the tool. You can search by your state, by your county, by institution, or by tribe. I don't believe the University of North Dakota is in here yet. My understanding is that the inventories are, if we were to update this, you might start to see University of North Dakota, but this is based on data from December. Yeah, we'll just do the state of North Dakota there. And so you can use this to start to see, make it a little more relatable to where you are and understand what has been taken from the state. So 300 ancestors from here, and even scroll down just still, and it gives you some ideas of where the ancestors have gone, and scroll down who in the state has collections, and then who outside the state, if you scroll a little more, who outside the state has holdings from here. And so Harvard on this list, December still had the greatest number. I wanted to just click on that, up one. I think the question came up right before the panel, why, as we were walking through this, why does Harvard have so much or why does Harvard have ancestral remains from this state when Harvard is, so far away? And that kind of speaks to what we were talking about earlier with the aggressive approach to collecting that has happened over the years. And Harvard has issued sort of statements in recent years apologizing for their past collecting practices. But there was a kind of a movement historically among institutions to build encyclopedic collections, which sort of, I think they saw as a way to just do the sort of research that this new field of anthropology at the time and archaeology called for. And so you want to scroll down just a little and then we can move on. And so I think this map, this is developed by one of my colleagues, but we kind of showed what is meant by encyclopedic collections. There's a couple other institutions that have collected in this way. None, I think, at the scale of Harvard, but like I think American Museum of Natural History, you would see these spikes across the country. The red stands for what is not yet been returned, and the green shows what has been repatriated. This is all Harvard, yeah.
universities, Harvard, but there are all sorts of institutions with all sorts of collections. Shannon, how did these things come into people's collections? I mean, if we're talking about hundreds of thousands of ancestors and artifacts, we're probably talking about hundreds of thousands of different stories for why these institutions have these items today.
Peoples have been treated throughout history, especially during colonization. You know, since the beginning, our items have been curiosities, and even at initial contact, those curiosities and bodies were taken. These to England and other places, educate folks in Europe about what North America was. Huge question about where did these people come from? Who are these savage, stoic, strong people in the Indies, right? Who are these people? And it quickly became clear over the first couple hundred years, and as the United States was becoming the United States of America, that Native peoples posed a problem because they held, they were utilizing land and resources, this new country to develop. And I love to think about today, if we really understood our gross national product, how the economy, this wonderful society that we have here in the United States, and the economy that we have, how every single dollar is really dependent on the takeover of Native peoples and this country. And I think if we were educated that, and would have a different perception of who Native people are, instead of having this problem that we do today, and why NAGPRA came, right? So idea of Native people as a curiosity, as a specimen, in US law became the reason for more research. And even the Surgeon General, I think 1860, had passed an order asking military and others to collect Native American bodies, especially skulls, for scientific inquiry. That inquiry of the day was called phrenology, where archaeologists the skull, different races of quotes when I say race, because it is thing further. But those that study phrenology, they would take skulls, beans, you know, certain weight of other kind of objects in the skulls to see which ethnic skull held the most beans, and that was the one with the bigger brain size, the bigger brain capacity, and everyone else was inferior to that. And Native people, enslaved people, those were the people that were being declared inferior out of this phrenology practice. It's been discredited. It wasn't discredited really until the 1980s. But if you think that the study of archaeology and anthropology based on that kind of objectification and ideology of who Native and other peoples were, they were savage, that they were different, that they were inferior, then if you're in a society like that, collecting and digging up things, finding things in your backyard, making your own museum around them. I've driven around I grew up in, and I've driven around all sorts of places in there where people have a sign on the side of the road, come see our museum, and you go into their garage and they have a museum of Caddo people. Full skeleton. This is just has been a societal norm. This is how this country has treated Native peoples, and this is the value that this country has placed on Native peoples and Native bodies. And so, of course, it's extremely emotional and difficult. And I think it's healthy to have discussion where we're in this uncomfortable place and where we can take accountability and responsibility for this and decide to be different and decide to do the right thing. I don't know that I answered your question at all, Dan, but I appreciate you asking.
Think in terms of the law and of legal remedies before NAGPRA. What did the landscape look like? Because we know that, you know, the sports team mascots issue with this university is very familiar with, that Indian people were objecting to their depiction as mascots as early as the first decade of the 1900s, that Indian people were complaining in Washington about the way they were depicted in movies as early as the 1920s. And all of this time up until NAGPRA was enacted, what were Native people able to do to get their ancestors and their sacred objects back?
Do anything, but there's recorded accounts even in the 1800s of Native nations requesting items back, particularly the Haudenosaunee, because Iroquois Confederacy in New York State, because the New York State Museum took over their entire wampum belt collection. Of course, Native people aren't capable of taking care of their own cultural patrimony and sacred items. So the New York State Museum became caretaker, and the Haudenosaunee fought for many decades before some of those wampum belts were finally returned. 20th century. There were also other cases, for example, and I can't remember the citation, but there's a Tunica Biloxi case that came forward prior to NAGPRA, in which the court declared that the institution who held items that were removed from a known Tunica Biloxi sacred site and burial site did not belong to that institution, and needed to be returned to the Tunica Biloxi tribe. And out of that, the Tunica Biloxi people developed a cultural center, and they're caring for their items and reburying their ancestors from early decision that helped kind of set forward the principles for the NMAI Act and NAGPRA. So Native peoples have always been fighting against their ancestors and cultural items.
How did we get NAGPRA, this tool that tribes now have at their disposal? They didn't always have. How were they able to successfully get that put in place?
Follow your lead.
Well, back to those Native advocates. So the Association on American Indian, NARF, Morning Star Institute, organizations together to create the legislative language, and also to meet with countless number of not just Congress folk, but museums and institutions to try to find some place. Institutions were absolutely opposed to turning Native American collections. Their fear was that everything from their institution would be gone. What would be their purpose anymore? They didn't have Native bodies and Native cultural heritage items to educate about. Well, what's interesting today, when we look back, is the institutions who have complied with NAGPRA and worked to consult on their collections realized that they knew nothing about the collections in their institutions, that they had not properly been caretaking for them, not have proper indexing or any kind of collected, reasonable, best practices type of way, industry practice way about their native. And many of the cultural heritage items they had in their collections, because of the market and rating that was going on between all encyclopedic institutions so they could make their collections more robust, that they never bothered to really understand what the items were in their collection. So when institutions began to consult with Native nations, they finally realized what that mask was and the importance of the tribe, right? And through that collaboration and consultation, they've been able to build relationships so that they can better educate the public in an appropriate about who Native nations are, their history, and their current cultures, and where they want to go in the future. In fact, there's beautiful tribal museums out there that also do an amazing job. There's about 150 tribal museums who teach about their own histories and own cultures. But the question that you asked was, how did we get here? And it couldn't have been done without those advocates. And the congresspersons were involved at that, were actually led and given field trips into the American Museum of Natural History, National Museum. They were, I'm trying to remember a word that some of the Senate used in describing what they saw when they saw hundreds, if not thousands, of ancestors in boxes labeled, you know, body parts. And what they were seeing is not skeleton and skeleton. I'm sorry, I'm put a trigger warning in the beginning of this. Most of the time, institutions will collect human remains and put all of one body part in boxes together. So they'll disassociate it funerary belongings. And so when the Senate and Congress folks were taken through these museums to see this with Native people to explain what they were looking at, they were horrified. And this is something that, in a bipartisan way, that Congress wanted to pass for Native people. And so Native people, Native advocates in those institutions fought like hell to get strong provisions. And I really believe that the act that was created by those before me is an amazing human rights law. There's very little in the act itself I would change. The regulations have been what is problematic. And the Department of Interior is currently undertaking, they've basically redone the entire set of regulations, and hopefully a final rulemaking is before October 1st this year that will create a brand new process that hopefully will be clear and simplified what we have today.
Talk about some of the things that institutions are doing well. And I should say that one of the things that's going well is the reporting that Mary and her team did has led to real results. One of the institutions that they identified as one of the 10 worst offenders that had never returned a single object has just in the last couple of weeks announced that they are making their first repatriation after that reporting. I think something like 50 local news outlets used your database to report on their local institutions. And so bringing light to this subject is one of the things that is going well. But you've also uncovered stories of institutions that are doing amazing things with their repatriation. Can you talk about some of those?
Yeah, I think that I'll just say really briefly, like I said earlier, there's a couple 100 institutions that have repatriated everything. And I think it is important to look to them because I think a lot of my reporting is accountability reporting. So I'm looking at what's wrong, and seeing that people say, "Oh, this work is really hard. This work is expensive. It requires all this research," which there's also counter arguments to that. But that to see that institutions have done it, and some of them may not have a collection the size of Harvard's, but nonetheless, there's also the Tennessee Valley Authority, which used to be kind of one of the institutions that was making the least progress under NAGPRA. I'm not going to be good with the numbers right now, but and then about a little more than a decade ago, the Government Accountability Office issued a report. This is how I see the narrative, looking at it 10 years after it all happened. So I wasn't in it, but that they issued a report, held them to task, and then you saw the institution start to repatriate more. They, I guess the news, I think in the last week or something, is that they are going to work towards repatriating everything they have. I think I think a lot about the numbers. Those sort of examples then put a case like University of California, Berkeley into more context, because I think they're still working through, they still have not quite up their pace on repatriation. And they are now the largest holders of Native American ancestors. And then I guess to answer your question, I think I only know what I know through my reporting. I have not sat in on consultations, and I know what tribes tell me, that repatriation really works well when there is a conversation. I think one of the things that works well about NAGPRA is also maybe one of the things that is holding it up, but that NAGPRA is a fulfilling experience for tribes, and museums gain from it when there's a conversation and there's an agreement about how the process should go. And we've also learned in our reporting that a lot of institutions don't have those conversations. Consultation may be a bit fuzzy under the law or current regulations, and so they might have just gotten a letter, a lot of the checking of the box of saying, okay, we told the tribes what we have, and we've filled that requirement. But when I think an institution really sits down and works towards repatriation, there's dialogue on both ends that sort of pays off over the years.
Want to name the other people who are part of this repatriation team?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So gosh, it's grown since I first started, but so Ash New developed our database. Ash has an incredible data skill set and coding skill set to work to create this. Logan Jaffe is my colleague in Illinois. She has reported primarily from there. Illinois is also a state with I think they have just a really difficult history, I think owing partly to forced removal. And then we also have an engagement reporter, new kind of journalism, Asia Fields, and she's worked with us to really think about sensitivity, reaching out to tribes, just as institutions should be speaking to tribal nations. We try to speak with people throughout the process about what it means to work on this story in a way that holds institutions to account, but is also sensitive to this is can be very private matter for a lot of cultures. So, no. Yeah.
Shannon, my last question before I allow some time for audience questions is, what do you think we could still be doing better? If you could make the law better, if you could make the regulations better, if you could make the community conversations better, what would you do?
The association has spent a lot of time looking at the act itself and working with Native nations to determine potential changes for the act. One of the biggest problems is the applicability of the act. So Congress made some really broad declarations about what types of items no institution would have the right to possess. And like I had mentioned before, those are ancestors, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. And all of those items and ancestors are defined as a national or a cultural or a community holding. I don't want to call them property because Native peoples don't see them as property, but they're held by a community. They're held by a nation as a type of community property. So that means one individual couldn't have dispossessed that from the nation unless that person had the authority in that nation to do so. So Congress made this broad declaration that these types of items, no one person could own or remove, even from a sale, from a Native nation without proper authorization from that nation at the time the item was taken. So even though the Congress made that broad declaration, it only provided a remedy when ancestors were found on federal or tribal land, or there were ancestors and cultural items being held by an institution who's received federal funds or a federal agency. So the law applies only to the public hands and public lands, is I call it. So when you look at other countries and their laws regarding cultural heritage, they often take the position, and I'm not suggesting this, but they often take the position that the cultural heritage found within their borders, that nation's cultural heritage, and that even folks that have collected that heritage in the past must disclose that those items in order to protect them for the nation in perpetuity. So the United States could as well declare that all Native cultural heritage is the heritage of those nations. And it doesn't matter if you're a private collector who collected from generations of family over time. So opening up the act to provide some type of remedy for the sale and commodification of our cultural heritage and even our bodies. There was a Native American skull that went up for auction in North Carolina just the last week or so. And auction houses are selling about 7,000 sensitive cultural heritage items a year. So there's still a huge market for sensitive items, and not just of Native items, indigenous and tribal peoples' cultural heritage all over the world from colonial nations that took over their land. So I think NAGPRA could be improved by providing remedies, private collection, and preventing the sale and commodification of cultural heritage.
For watching us on the Zoom. I think Mike is going to be monitoring in case there are questions come in there. And if there are questions in the room, Dalton, if I can have you run this mic to people. Are there questions in the room for our guests? You've told them everything they want to know. Anything on the Zoom, Mike?
What is the government institution that NAGPRA. Higher ed institute. Department of
To the first question, which is the National Park Service within the Interior Department is currently the place with oversight. They have a smaller office within NPS called the National NAGPRA program. And then there is a review committee, which Shannon was on as well, where tribes can, I'm not sure if this is the technical term, but like bring their grievances, bring their outline situations that they're facing.
The other part of your question was,
Well, what's left?
Are we still missing a lot of institutions that haven't come forward?
we are, and a lot of those institutions are smaller institutions who usually like more historical societies, but not country. But you know, every once in a while, something odd will pop up. For example, there was a city library that had collections from the 1800s. They didn't have a budget. They were having a hard time struggling to keep the doors open of their city library. So they went to, I believe, an auction house. I think it was Bonham's Auction House, to sell the collection. And immediately, tribal advocates, the association, and others let them know, let Bonham's know, and law enforcement that they were actually, there's a provision of NAGPRA that doesn't allow you to illegally traffic in NAGPRA items. So, but beyond that, we really don't know what the numbers are. We really don't know what else is out there. I've heard a lot of numbers, and like I said, into the millions, but we have no way of understanding that. I mean, if you consider this country, Turtle Island has been the home of people for since time immemorial. You know, so there is a lot of culture in this country that, because of amateur archaeology and other just interested people picking things up as they see them, that has totally disassociated us from really understanding what has happened beneath our feet, and hasn't allowed even Native histories to come forward to try to close the gaps of what we know and what we don't know.
Thank you.
I'm curious about funding, where funding is coming from for this process. Is there funding for the institutions? Are institutions expected to provide the funding? Is there federal funding within the law? Where, I mean, like,
Do the numbers. I think there's a bigger conversation here. So I think the NAGPRA grants, I was just looking at the spreadsheet recently, they've maybe awarded about $50 million over 30 years. Institution that's received the most. Yes, sorry, federal grants. Yeah, thank you. That are administered through the Park Service right now. I think the institution that received the most is the Field Museum, and they might have received $1 million. I want to say $1 million. I'd have to double check. And then I think museums have received actually just more than half of that money over time. People criticize it for being not enough. But there is definitely a bigger conversation there. I think especially with the bigger institutions that have big budgets. I'll just ask the question, I won't answer it, but like, what does it mean to account for your past with the money that you do have? So.
Response on this, because and I know it's a justifiable excuse, so I don't want to shut down the question. It is an issue that it does require some funding and staff, which National NAGPRA program can provide. It is they're competitive grants, but they go through an annual process, and there's also funding for tribes for the repatriation part. So the actual repatriation, that funding is a little more accessible, and that can help secure the ancestors and their items and proper materials to return home, and the travel. But institutions, libraries, academia, they're all legal entities that have legal responsibilities in order to have the types of 50C3, 501c3 status, or whatever the status is. You're supposed to comply with federal and state laws, and this is one of those laws. What I often see institutions doing is not prioritizing their responsibilities under NAGPRA so that their funding is going elsewhere. I see the Field Museum, a lot of money and great publicity about redoing their entire exhibit, which hadn't been redone since the early 1900s. It was a horrible diorama exhibit of Native peoples, and they've fully redone that and really involved the community. But still, there are more than 1,300 bodies in their basement that have not been repatriated. And at the time, there was only one person allowed to staff that position. So that tells me where that institution's priorities are. And the Field Museum, in my opinion, hasn't had priorities set correctly. And I think their funders should know that. So I think institutions and federal agencies can adjust their expenditures to take care of what is their responsibility to take care of. This shouldn't be something that's pushed off. Wait for the next administration to handle it. We've got other plans for our money. We can't do that any longer. And I think the work that ProPublica is doing and Native nations are doing to bring out this issue will hopefully embarrass and ridicule people into compliance, which is not a bad thing. It's better than litigation.
Shooting your paycheck in the foot. The only thing I'll add to those very good answers is it's a classic problem of politics, right? It's easy for Congress to identify what it thinks is important. It's harder for Congress to throw your tax dollars at it. And so if you think this is important, remind your representatives, remind your senators that they need to make sure they pass this law. They need to make sure that institutions are able to comply. And if that means a little bit more NAGPRA grant money, that's probably not going to break the bank. None of us are going to skip lunch because we had to cover that bill. Got time for probably one more question if there's one more out there.
Buju, I'm curious, you mentioned matriation and seeds, and I'm curious if the USDA required to be NAGPRA compliant, and how, if not, how do institutions who have potential seeds and rematriation efforts, how do we support that and that sort of thing?
Repatriation Act has been used to indigenous seeds and put them back in the earth in collaboration and consultation with Native nations. And I look to the University of Michigan as kind of one of the pioneers doing that work hand in hand with Native nations. So it's a matter of what we're defining those seeds as. Are those seeds part of a Native American collection? Are they cultural patrimony of specific affiliated Native nations? Because the USDA is obviously a federal agency and has to be compliant under NAGPRA. So there's some legal questions and further fact finding, I think, done to really answer the question about where those seeds came from, they belong, and then next step. Because I can imagine that USDA and others want to nationalize, want to that intellectual property versus giving it away. And that's a complicated issue considering, food sovereignty, and other things. So that's a really big question. I hope to hear more about that soon.
Me too.
Here in the law school, Brian Pappas, an opportunity to give some closing remarks before we all go downstairs for some refreshments.
Well, it's always good to be between people in a reception. But let's give them a round of applause. This was just a terrific. What an enlightening and interesting session. I learned a great deal, and I know that you did as well. Really proud that here at North Dakota, we are facing these head on. And it matters that we do this in the right way, that we are engaging in those conversations. You mentioned that the places that have done it well have really done it collaboratively, have worked very closely with tribal nations. Thanks to President Armacost, and that's the way that we're going about this, and I'm very proud of that. We don't want this to be a simple apology and fix. That's not what it's about. It's about doing the right thing, and making sure that we continue to do the right things in relationships along the way. And these kinds of sessions are part of that process. I'm interested in this topic because it's a lot to us. We're very proud of our Northern Plains Indian Law Center, our tribal justice. It's a big part of who we are. So thank you for being here and for all the work that you.
I want to close by thanking the law school and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office at the university for supporting this program, to helping to bring them, our speakers here, to thanking everyone, many of them are in this room, who are working on the university's ongoing repatriation efforts and making sure that this university does what's right, helping the people who made sure that there's nothing in the law school building that shouldn't be here. We've just, in the last week, been able to ensure that this place is clean. And thank all of you for coming. We don't succeed in this without a community that understands, and being part of this conversation has been very important. Thank you all.